The air in the grand ballroom of the Astoria Hotel was thick with the scent of money and expensive perfume. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of tuxedos and silk gowns. Men with names etched onto skyscrapers laughed too loudly, their voices echoing off the marble columns. Women with diamonds nesting in their throats smiled with practiced ease, their eyes scanning the room, calculating, always calculating. This was the annual Vanguard Charity Gala, a night where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their generosity by bidding millions on things they did not need. And through this glittering ecosystem of power, Amara Adebayo moved like a shadow. Her uniform was a crisp, black dress, simple and severe. Her hands, steady and sure, carried a silver tray laden with champagne flutes. To the guests, she was invisible, a functional piece of the scenery, no more significant than the velvet ropes or the floral arrangements. She was a waitress. And in this room, that meant she was nothing. At the center of the ballroom, holding court at the most prominent table, sat Arthur Vance. He was a man built of brutish confidence and tailored suits. His face was perpetually flushed, a testament to rich food and a richer temper. Vance was a titan of finance, a so-called maverick, who had clawed his way to the top of Wall Street with the subtlety of a bulldozer. His company, Vance Capital, was a monument to his own ruthless genius. He loved to tell stories of his triumphs, his voice a booming instrument of self-congratulation. His guests, a collection of sycophants and lesser wolves, hung on his every word, their laughter a synchronized chorus of approval. Amara approached his table, her movements fluid and efficient. She began refilling water glasses, her gaze kept respectfully low, her presence meant to be felt only by the silent replenishment of their needs. Vance was in the middle of a story, gesticulating wildly with a hand that wore a gold watch worth more than Amara's entire life. "So I told the board, you can either follow my lead, or you can follow this company into bankruptcy," he roared, and his table erupted in the expected laughter. His eyes, small and predatory, scanned his audience and then, as if for the first time, landed on Amara. A cruel smile spread across his lips. He saw her dark skin, her simple uniform, her quiet servitude. He saw a prop. He leaned forward, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. Well, what do we have here?" Amara paused, the water pitcher held steady in her hand. She did not speak. Vance gestured toward her with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Gentlemen, we talk of markets and mergers, of billions made and lost. But perhaps we're missing a crucial perspective." His guests chuckled, sensing the beginning of a cruel game. He looked directly at Amara, his smile widening. "Tell me," he said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "You're here, serving us, you must hear all sorts of things. What's your expert financial opinion? Where should I invest my next 100 million? The question hung in the air, a poisoned dart. It was pure humiliation. A joke designed to reinforce the chasm between his world and hers. He was asking a black waitress for financial advice. The insult was as clear as the diamonds on his wife's neck. The table roared with laughter. One man slapped the table, his face red with mirth. Another snickered into his napkin, avoiding eye contact but clearly enjoying the spectacle. It was a public flaying, a casual act of cruelty performed for sport. Amara felt the heat of 100 pairs of eyes on her. They were all watching, waiting for her to stammer, to blush, to shrink into herself and apologize for her own existence. They saw a servant, a nobody, a target. She remained perfectly still. She did not flinch. She did not look away. Instead, she slowly, deliberately, placed the water pitcher on her tray. She straightened her back, a subtle shift that seemed to add inches to her height. Her calm was a strange, unnerving thing in the face of such mockery. It was a silence that spoke louder than any protest. Vance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected fear, or at least embarrassment. This quiet dignity was infuriating. It was a rejection of the role he had assigned her. What's the matter? He goaded, his voice growing harsher. Cat got your tongue? Or is the world of high finance a little too complicated for you? More laughter, but this time it was a little more strained. Amara finally lifted her eyes and met his. Her gaze was not angry. It was not fearful. It was level, clear, and analytical, like a scientist studying an insect. And then, she spoke. Her voice was low, but it cut through the noise of the ballroom with surgical precision. Your portfolio is overleveraged in emerging market tech derivatives, particularly those tied to the cobalt supply chain in the Congo. A minor political disruption, which my models predict is imminent, will trigger a cascade failure. You stand to lose everything. Silence. A profound, ringing silence fell over the table, then spread to the tables nearby like a shockwave. The laughter died in men's throats. The words were so specific, so technical, so utterly unexpected. They were not the words of a waitress. Vance stared at her, his jaw slack. His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just heard. She had just dissected the most vulnerable part of his empire with the casual confidence of a seasoned analyst. How could she possibly know that? His shock quickly curdled into rage. She had defied him. She had turned his joke back on him and made him look foolish. You think you're clever, he snarled, his face turning a blotchy red. You read a headline in a newspaper and think you understand my business. He stood up, knocking his chair back. He had to reassert his dominance. He had to crush her. All right, Miss Expert, he bellowed, his voice booming across the stunned ballroom. You want to play? Let's play. He pointed a trembling finger at her. I'll make you a deal. Right here, right now. You give me one piece of actionable advice. 1. If it makes my company $1 by market close tomorrow, I'll write you a check for $1 million. A gasp went through the crowd. But, he continued, his voice a low growl, if you're wrong, if you're just spewing nonsense you overheard, you're fired. And I will personally see to it that you never serve another drink, clean another floor, or work another day in this city. I will blacklist you from every janitorial service to every restaurant. You'll be on the street. The bet was outrageously cruel, a sledgehammer to crack a nut. He was offering her a fortune he could easily spare against the threat of her total ruin. Everyone waited for her to crumble. They expected her to apologize, to beg, to retract her words. Amara simply looked at him, her expression unchanging. That's not a fair wager, she said calmly. Vance let out a triumphant bark of a laugh. Oh, it's not. I'm sorry, is reality too harsh for you? No, she replied, her voice steady. The stakes are too low. The room held its breath. $1 million is a rounding error to you, Mr. Vance. It's an insult. It means nothing. My livelihood, however, means everything to me. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. The power dynamic in the room had inverted. Suddenly, she was not the one on trial. He was. So let's make a real bet, she said. A bet between equals. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. I will wager everything I have in this world. My entire life savings. $4,256.18. A few people let out a disbelieving chuckle at the paltry sum. Against, she continued, her eyes locked on his, your company. All of it. Vance Capital. The chuckles died instantly. The proposal was so audacious, so insane, that no one knew how to react. Vance stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Was this a joke? Was she mad? You want to bet your $4,000 against my $10 billion firm? He asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and fury. Yes, Amara said. My analysis against yours. My life against your legacy. Unless, of course, you're not as confident in your position as you pretend to be. It was a direct challenge to his ego, thrown down in front of his peers, his rivals, and the city's media. To back down now would be an admission of fear. An admission that this waitress might actually know something he didn't. He was trapped. He looked around at the sea of faces, all watching him, waiting. His reputation was on the line. With a sneer born of pure arrogance and rage, he made the worst decision of his life. "You're on," he spat. "Tomorrow, at market close, we'll see who's left standing. I'm going to enjoy watching you beg on the sidewalk." Amara simply nodded. "I accept." The words were quiet, but they sealed his doom. As Vance stewed in his own fury, Amara's mind drifted back. Back to a time before the black uniform and the silver tray. Back to a life filled with warmth and numbers. She remembered her father, Samuel Adebayo. He was a quiet, brilliant man with kind eyes and hands that were always covered in ink from his calculations. He wasn't a Wall Street shark, he was a pure economist, a man who saw the world not in dollars and cents, but in elegant, flowing equations. He had taught her to read market charts before she could read storybooks. Their small apartment had been filled not with toys, but with books on behavioral economics and quantum finance. "The market isn't a machine, Amara," he had told her, his voice a gentle rumble. "It's a heart. It beats with fear and greed. If you listen closely, you can hear its rhythm." She had been a prodigy. At Wharton, they called her the Oracle. She saw patterns others missed, predicted downturns with uncanny accuracy. She didn't just understand the data, she felt it. She graduated summa cum laude at 19 and was courted by every major firm in the country. She and her father had started their own small advisory firm, Adebayo and Daughter. They were ethical. They were brilliant. And they were developing something revolutionary. It was a predictive algorithm, one that didn't just analyze past performance but incorporated geopolitical data, sentiment analysis from global news, and even meteorological patterns to predict supply chain disruptions. It was her life's work. Her father's masterpiece. It was the key to a new, more stable way of investing. And Arthur Vance had stolen it. He had approached them under the guise of a partnership. He had praised their work, lavished them with attention, and promised them the world. They had trusted him. They had shown him their code, their models, their research. A week later, he announced the launch of the Vance algorithm, a revolutionary tool that was a mirror image of their own. He filed patents, claimed it as his own invention, and used it to build his empire. Then, he turned on them. He used their own stolen weapon against them. He shorted their clients, poached their investors, and buried them in frivolous lawsuits they couldn't afford to fight. Adebayo and Daughter was ruined. Her father was destroyed. The shame and the stress of the betrayal were too much for his heart to bear. Amara had found him slumped over his desk, a final, desperate calculation scrawled on the notepad beside him. He died from a massive coronary. He died of a broken heart, murdered by greed. The world saw Arthur Vance as a genius. Amara saw him as a thief and a killer. In that moment, grief had forged itself into a cold, hard resolve. She would not sue. She would not go to the press. That was his game, a game of money and lawyers. She would lose. No. She would take from him what he had taken from her father. Everything. So she disappeared. Amara Adebayo, the Oracle of Wharton, vanished. In her place was just Amara, a quiet woman who applied for a job with the catering company that serviced all of Arthur Vance's favorite venues. For 2 years, she had served him champagne. For 2 years, she had listened. She listened to his drunken boasts, his careless conversations, his snippets of strategy. She studied him. She updated her father's algorithm with every new piece of information she gathered. And she waited. She waited for the perfect moment, when his arrogance was at its peak and his guard was completely down. She had waited for this night. This wasn't a random outburst. It was a planned execution. Her quiet words in the ballroom were not a guess. They were a death sentence, 2 years in the making. Back in the present, the grand ballroom was a hive of frantic energy. Amara walked away from Vance's table, leaving him sputtering in her wake. She did not return to the kitchens. Instead, she walked to an empty table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. The act was a rebellion in itself. A servant, sitting among the masters. But no one dared to stop her. The room's attention was now split between the furious billionaire and the impossibly calm waitress. People were on their phones, their voices hushed but urgent. Get me everything on Vance Capital's derivatives. What's the latest out of Kinshasa? Who the hell is that woman? Amara ignored them all. She took a bread roll from the basket on the table and began to eat it, slowly, methodically. The performance had begun. Her first words had been the opening salvo. Now, she would let the market do the rest. Vance, after a moment of apoplectic rage, was now scrambling. He was on his phone, barking orders at his terrified analysts. Check the cobalt futures. Now. What do you mean you don't know? Find out. His face, which had been red with anger, was now beginning to pale. The confidence was draining out of him, replaced by a creeping, gnawing dread. A young financial reporter from the Wall Street Journal, smelling the biggest story of his career, cautiously approached Amara's table. Miss, he began, his voice hesitant. That was, quite a statement. Can you elaborate on your prediction? Amara finished chewing her bread roll. She looked at the young man. Vance Capital's primary tech fund is heavily invested in 3 major semiconductor manufacturers, she said, her voice as clear and calm as a lecture hall professor. Those manufacturers rely on a single, obscure supplier in Taiwan for a specific refined cobalt composite. She paused. That supplier, Feng Electronics, has been secretly falsifying its quality control reports for the last 6 months to cover a production flaw. This was triggered by a labor strike at their primary refinery in the DRC, which Vance's own public statements on tariff instability actually helped to provoke. The reporter's eyes widened. He was typing furiously into his phone. This morning, Amara continued, a German auto manufacturer, their biggest client, discovered the flaw during routine testing. They are preparing to issue a total recall and a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. The news will break in an hour, just as the Asian markets open. Feng's stock will be worthless by sunrise. She took a sip of water. The semiconductor companies will have their supply chain cut off. Their stock will plummet. Vance's fund is leveraged 3-to-1 on their success. The margin calls will be catastrophic. It will trigger a complete collapse of his firm's liquid assets. She laid it all out, not with malice, but with the detached certainty of a mathematician solving an equation. It was a symphony of destruction, and she knew every note. On the other side of the room, Arthur Vance's face had turned the color of ash. One of his aides rushed over, phone pressed to his ear, his expression one of sheer panic. He whispered frantically to his boss. Vance's phone dropped from his hand and clattered onto the marble floor. He knew. He knew it was all true. The mockery on the faces of the audience had long since vanished. Stunned silence had given way to a low murmur of awe. They were witnessing something impossible. The complete, systematic dismantling of a financial empire by a waitress with a bread roll. Then, a voice cut through the murmur. My God, said an old man with a shock of white hair, standing at a table near the back. I know her. All eyes turned to him. He was Julian Croft, a legendary, semi-retired investor, known for his sharp mind and sharper tongue. He walked slowly toward Amara, his eyes wide with a recognition that bordered on reverence. You're Samuel Adebayo's daughter, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Amara. They called you the Oracle of Wharton. The name rippled through the room. The Oracle of Wharton. It was a legend, a ghost story traders told about a young genius who had vanished from the scene years ago. Now, the ghost was here, in a waitress uniform. The puzzle pieces began to click into place in everyone's mind. This wasn't a lucky guess. This was expertise of the highest order. This wasn't a random confrontation. This was a reckoning. Vance looked from Croft to Amara, a dawning, horrific understanding on his face. Adebayo. The name hit him like a physical blow. He finally remembered. The small, brilliant firm he had crushed. The old man he had ruined. This was not a waitress. This was a ghost from his past, returned to collect a debt. Amara stood up, her composure absolute. Yes, she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. I am Amara Adebayo. She reached into the small pocket of her apron, the one meant for order pads and pens. She pulled out a small, simple USB flash drive. She held it up for the room to see. And this, she announced, contains the original, time-stamped source code for my father's algorithm. The one you stole and renamed the Vance algorithm. A collective gasp filled the ballroom. This was more than just a bad bet. This was career-ending fraud. That's a lie. Vance shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. A fabrication. You have no proof. On the contrary, a new voice said, calm and authoritative. A man in a conservative suit, who had been sitting quietly at a corner table, stood up. He walked toward the center of the room, followed by two other similarly dressed individuals. We have all the proof we need. He held up a badge. Agent Miller. Securities and Exchange Commission. The room descended into chaos. Agent Miller turned to Vance, his expression grim. Arthur Vance, we've been investigating you for months. Miss Adebayo came to us 6 weeks ago. Her evidence was comprehensive. He gestured to the USB drive in Amara's hand. That drive contains the original code, as she said. But it also contains a backdoor she and her father built into it. For the last 2 years, every trade you've made, every crime you've committed using their stolen work, has been logged and sent directly to a secure server. Vance's world was not just collapsing. It was being vaporized. We have you for securities fraud, intellectual property theft, racketeering, and market manipulation, Agent Miller stated, listing the charges like a death notice. Amara spoke again, her voice cutting through Vance's hyperventilating breaths. And I, she said, her voice laced with the cold fire of long-nurtured justice, will be filing a civil suit for corporate sabotage and the wrongful death of my father, Samuel Adebayo. I will be seeking damages equal to the total value of Vance Capital. Your company is now mine, by the terms of your own bet. It was total annihilation. He had not just lost a wager. He had lost everything. His company, his freedom, his name. Vance, the Titan, the master of the universe, began to crumble. No, he whimpered, a pathetic, broken sound. No, you can't. I have lawyers. I have money. He looked around wildly, his eyes begging for help from the people who had been laughing at his jokes just minutes before. They all looked away. His power was gone. He was nothing. You can't do this to me, he screamed, a final, futile roar of a dying animal. He lunged, not at Amara, but toward the exit, a desperate attempt to flee. Agent Miller's associates moved with swift, practiced efficiency. They intercepted him, spun him around, and forced his hands behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the silent ballroom. It was the sound of a world ending. The federal agents began to lead the disgraced billionaire away. His tailored suit was rumpled, his face was a mask of sweat and tears. He was a hollowed-out shell of the man who had entered the room. He passed the tables of his former friends and colleagues, who now stared at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. The reporters' phones were up, their cameras flashing, capturing every moment of his public shaming. As they led him past the table where she stood, his eyes met Amara's one last time. They were filled with a burning, impotent hatred. Amara simply held his gaze, her expression not of triumph, but of a profound, sorrowful peace. Justice had been done. After he was gone, a silence fell over the room once more. All eyes were on Amara. She was no longer a waitress. She was the most powerful person in the room. She looked out at the assembled faces of the city's elite. "He made a fatal error in calculation," she said, her voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable strength. "He looked at me and saw a uniform. He saw my race. He saw a person he believed was beneath him, someone without value." She let her gaze sweep across the entire, opulent room. "He thought value was something you could trade on a stock exchange. He thought worth was measured in dollars. He was wrong." She stood taller, her voice rising with passion. "True value is not in your portfolio or the name on your building. It is in the dignity you afford every single person you meet. It is in the character you build, the integrity you maintain. It is something he never had, and could never understand." She paused, letting the truth of her words sink in. Tonight, he lost his company. But he lost his soul long ago. With that, she turned and walked away, not toward the kitchens, but toward the grand exit, leaving a room full of the world's most powerful people in stunned, contemplative silence. 6 months later. The name Vance Capital was a footnote in financial history books, a cautionary tale of hubris and fraud. Arthur Vance's trial had been a media sensation, short and brutal. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his high-priced lawyers could do nothing. Convicted on all counts, he was sentenced to 30 years in a federal penitentiary. His assets were seized. His properties were liquidated. His wife filed for divorce the day after the verdict, taking what little was left. His children changed their last names and refused to take his calls. The last press photo of him showed a gaunt, gray-haired man in an orange jumpsuit, mopping a hallway in a prison commissary. He was broken, forgotten, and utterly alone. He had been stripped of everything, left with only the gaping void where his character should have been. His downfall was absolute. Amara Adebayo, however, had ascended. After winning the largest wrongful death settlement in the history of New York, she did not simply retire. She had a purpose. She used the vast fortune to launch a new firm, built from the ashes of Vance's empire. She called it the Adebayo Legacy Fund. It was unlike any other firm on Wall Street. Its founding principle was ethical alpha, the belief that one could generate superior returns without sacrificing moral integrity. She hired the brightest minds she could find, not from the usual Ivy League pool, but from community colleges, historically black universities, and overlooked communities. She sought out intelligence and character, not pedigree. The firm's primary mission was to invest in minority-owned startups, green energy projects, and companies with proven track records of treating their employees with dignity and respect. The old guard of Wall Street scoffed. They called her naive, a bleeding heart. They predicted her swift failure. They were wrong. Using a refined version of her father's algorithm, now perfected to identify companies with strong ethical foundations, the Adebayo Legacy Fund posted staggering returns. It outperformed every major index in its first year. Amara became a legend, not just for her intellect, but for her vision. She proved that decency and profit were not mutually exclusive. She became one of the most respected and influential voices in global finance. But her impact went far beyond the stock market. She established the Samuel Adebayo Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing full scholarships and mentorship for underprivileged students pursuing careers in finance and economics. She wanted to ensure that the next generation of leaders would be armed not just with knowledge, but with a strong moral compass. The Foundation's programs transformed thousands of lives, creating a new, more diverse pipeline of talent into an industry that had for too long been a closed-off club. Her actions sent ripples through the corporate world. Companies began to reevaluate their own ethics, not just out of fear, but out of a genuine desire to emulate her success. The story of the waitress who toppled a titan became a modern fable, a testament to the power of quiet strength and meticulous preparation. It was a story that taught a profound and timeless lesson. It showed the world that true poverty is not the absence of money, but the absence of empathy. It proved that arrogance is a blindness, a self-inflicted wound that prevents one from seeing the immense value hidden in plain sight. And it affirmed, for all to see, that a person's true worth is not determined by their job title, their bank account, or the color of their skin. It is measured by the content of their character, the depth of their integrity, and the quiet dignity with which they carry themselves, whether in a palace or in the shadows. A lesson Arthur Vance learned far too late, and one Amara Adebayo embodied for the rest of her extraordinary life.